Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for opening our trunk this morning so we can worship with you this morning. Lord, that was a blessing. It's the little things when we rely on you, Lord, that you pull through, and we are so grateful. Lord, I am so grateful also for you sending Jesus down for us, taking away our sins, Lord. Wow, that's pretty awesome. Lord, and now I thank you so much for giving us hope of your coming back, Lord, coming back for us. And Lord, I just appreciate that we have this church family to lift us up during those times that we struggle. Today happens to be quite full, and I'm grateful for that as well, Lord. I just praise you in every way, and I thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name.
Today's reading is from Matthew 24, verses 36 through 44. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. The word of the Lord.
Amen. Thank you for that reading, Scott, and for the prayer story. So we've arrived at the first Sunday of Advent, and it's hard to believe that we've completed another year together as a church. For many of us, Advent is a very exciting time. It's filled with anticipation. As a child, my anticipation was probably more about Christmas morning and gifts than it was anything else. But I learned a little bit during that season about waiting and anticipating something good that was coming. For others, Advent is a time of high anxiety, right? It's a time of even panic maybe, and hurrying around to this or that gathering and trying to find a little extra money to spend on gifts for friends or family. It's a time of strained relationships, maybe even for some of us, of seeing people from whom you've been estranged. Perhaps family for some of us is not a safe place or a happy place. And during the holidays, you find yourself once again having to be around people whom are difficult or maybe you struggle with or have caused you pain. Whatever your experience, though, Advent is a time of roughly 4 weeks of anticipation, which finally relents, maybe for some of us, on Christmas Day, on December 25th. But the challenge with this season, and maybe for all seasons, but definitely for this one, is to keep its true meaning in front of us, right? What is Advent really about? Why do we do all of this? Why do we talk about these things? Why the trees and the presents and the caroling and the parties? Why all the hullabaloo? The word Advent means coming. What coming? What's coming? Who's coming? Well, when you come to the Bible, you find a lot of talk about future things, about things to come. But one of the most common and most prominent future coming things throughout the Scriptures is the promise of a coming figure who would defeat Satan and evil and bring peace and deliverance to his people. In fact, we don't have to wait very long after the creation story to find God already talking about this. all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we find the first place where promises are made and where people begin anticipating or waiting upon someone who is going to come. In Genesis 3:15, we have God saying that a future descendant of the woman, Eve, will crush the head of the serpent, Satan, who leads man and woman into sin in the garden. Many theologians call this the proto-evangelium, which is a fancy way of saying the first announcement of the gospel, or the good news, that one is coming who would deliver man and woman from their sins. So right off in the Scriptures, we have a sense of anticipation, a sense of forward-looking, right, that a great deliverer is coming. Of course, over time, God would make many more promises to his people and would add many layers to that promise. We know that he would be one like Moses, who delivered his people from captivity. We know that he would be a son of King David. We know that he would be born of a virgin. We know that he would be a suffering servant, one who was crushed and afflicted, one whose own wounds bring about our healing. We know that he will give sight to the blind and set the prisoners free. We know that he will pour out his Spirit on young and old and men and women and slave and free. All of this and much more we know from later promises that were given in the time of the Old Testament prophets. All of this, of course, would take many hundreds of years, even thousands of years to unfold. But finally, he came in the person of Jesus Christ, and the world has never been the same. But things didn't stop there, did they? No, history didn't end. His people didn't just go right up to heaven, right? Things continued. With the coming of Jesus came new insights into the Old Testament prophets and also new prophecies about the future. So although the advent or coming of the Messiah, the Christ figure of the Old Testament, is here, that does not mean we are done waiting, does it? No. Christians, you and I are still waiting today. What are we waiting for now? Over and over again, the New Testament talks about Jesus coming again. One well-known story is found in Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. I'm just going to read that for you. Then they gathered, that is, the disciples, around him and asked him, "Lord, are you going at this time to restore the kingdom to Israel?" And he said to them, "It is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." After he said this, he was taken up before their very sight, and a cloud hid them from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way. You've seen him go. He's coming back. He's going to come back." There it is. This same Jesus will return just as you've seen him go. And in many other places, similar things are said of Christ. And Advent is a time for us to talk about that and express that reality in tangible ways. Like today, for instance, we light the candle of hope. Okay? Hope has a couple of things that I think are worth pointing out at this point. Hope points to a future reality, right? It points forwards. Take Romans chapter 8, verses 24 and 25, for instance. It says this, "For in this hope we are saved." Now, hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes in what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So hope is about something that is to come, that we don't yet see, right? That's the first thing to acknowledge about hope. But secondly, hope also points to something wonderful, right? We don't hope in bad things. We hope in good things, right? So there are good things that are coming, that are yet to come. Romans 8, that same passage, talks about how all creation groans as though it were in childbirth for the restoration of the earth and the revealing of the sons of God. So there are good things that have not yet happened, so we hope in them, right? We look forwards to them. So today, we lit the candle of hope to say, yes, of course, Christ has come. He has fulfilled many prophecies, but not all is complete yet. And we are still waiting for his final coming and for the complete and full restoration of all things. Well, the church has picked up on this, and that is why historically Advent has been a time when Christians actively anticipate for the second coming of Christ. The Latin word adventus, where we get the word Advent from, is the Latin translation of the Greek word parousia, which is a word commonly used for Christ's second coming. And because of Christmas, I think, probably, which follows right after the season of Advent, and because of the huge commercialization of the holiday, it's easy to think only of Christ's first coming, right? Or first Advent during these few weeks. But I think that would be a mistake. Because as I've already said, we are still today waiting upon Christ to come again. We live in that already and not yet period of time that I've spoken of before. And I know some of you have heard me talk about this before. Christ has already come and brought fulfillment to many of the promises that we see in the Old Testament, but they are not yet completely fulfilled in some senses. For instance, God has promised that he will complete the work that he has started in us who believe. In a sense, that promise is already fulfilled, right? We're complete in Christ, and before him we are blameless and we are clean now, right now. However, we still live in this sinful flesh. We still live in the world. We got the devil against us and all the forces of darkness, right? And we struggle every day. So the full fulfillment of that promise will not happen until the day of Christ when he returns again. And we're given our perfect resurrection bodies. The already and the not yet. So we're already complete and not yet complete. You see that? This is what Advent is all about for us as Christians. We live in that in-between time, in between the two Advents of Jesus. So even today, as Christians, we are still in a posture of waiting and anticipating. And that is what Advent is about. So as we come to our passage today, we're going to see this directly, I think, in the text. We're going to see that although the Messiah, Jesus, has come, the believers are still anticipating some things. They're still looking forwards for something else. They're still looking into the future. One of those things is that Jesus is going to leave for a time and then come back. Well, how did they get this idea, right? How did they come up with, the disciples, of course, didn't come up with this themselves. Where did they get this idea from? Well, Jesus told them, right? Maybe one of the most famous instances of this is in John 14, verses 1 through 3. A very famous passage, wonderful passage to be reminded of in a time of grief especially. Jesus says these words in John 14, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may also be." So Jesus, right, has been actively teaching the disciples that he's going to depart for a time and then come back. And in our text before us today, we find something similar. Jesus is teaching. And what you find if you look back at the beginning of this section in Matthew 24 is that this discussion was started by the disciples asking a question in verse 3. Jesus tells them in verse 2 that the temple is going to be destroyed, right? Not one stone will be left unturned, he said. And in verse 3, the disciples ask him this question. "Tell us then, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And then Jesus takes the next couple of chapters, basically, to answer the question and do some teaching. This section is known as the Olivet Discourse because verse 3 says that Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives as he taught. Now let me say at the outset, before we get into some of the details of the passage here, that this is a very complicated text. And I am not going to be able to solve all the conundrums here. I'm probably going to maybe answer a few questions that I'm going to present. There's going to be 100 others that are going to come up out of what I have to say here. I don't have time. I wish I did. I wish I would know. Honestly, not any theologians written books about this. They don't have the answers either, right? There's a lot of conundrums here and difficulties, and we're not real sure how to piece it all together exactly. And if we would read through the entire chapter, you would see, right, that there's some need for some real explanation on some things. We just don't have time for all of it today. So, that being said, my goal today is pretty modest, okay? I've got a really modest goal in front of me. There's 3 parts to what I'd like to try and accomplish in the next few minutes, if that's even possible. The first part of my goal is just to establish the fact that Jesus is going to come again. We've already done that, right? I've already looked at a few texts. We've already talked about that. That much has been said. We've looked at a couple passages that indicate that. So hopefully we've got that much. Advent is a season of waiting upon that great and glorious event. Jesus is coming again. But there's still 2 other things that I'd like to try and do with the short little time that I've got in this little paragraph that I've got before us this morning. And the second one is this, is to just give us a few details about his return. So I'm not going to solve all the problems, but maybe I can help with a few of the details about his return. And the first one I'm going to try and establish is this, that we do not know and cannot know when it will happen. Not even Christ knew. All right, so that's the first detail. I'm going to explain that in just a moment. Second detail is that it will happen during a time when business as usual is being conducted, during everyday life. That's when he's going to return. And then the third detail is that it will happen soon. All right, the first one. We do not know and cannot know when it will happen. All right, so I hope that's pretty straightforward in the passage. This is one of the parts the disciples were asking about. When is it going to happen, Lord? When is all this stuff going to happen? And Jesus responds in verse 36 with these shocking words. Basically, I don't know, right? Isn't that shocking to hear Jesus say that, right? Verse 36, look there if you would with me. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Does it bother you to hear Jesus say that he doesn't know? Some Christians, I think, are taken aback by this expression because they wonder how Jesus, the Son of God, cannot know something. It seems to challenge his deity, right? Well, R.C. Sproul in his commentary, R.C. Sproul has a wonderful commentary on Matthew, on this passage, he points out that even the great theologian of the Roman Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas, maybe some of y'all have heard that name before, he stumbled over this passage. If Jesus is both God and man, perfectly united in the incarnation, when Jesus took on flesh, that's what that word means, the incarnation, then he must know everything. So why in the world does he say that he doesn't know here? Aquinas came up with something that he called the accommodation theory. The accommodation theory. Basically, the accommodation theory says that Jesus really did know the hour, but that knowledge was too much for the people to bear. Therefore, to accommodate their weakness, he simply told them he did not know. R.C. Sproul says that this explanation preserves the omniscience of Jesus, the fact that Jesus knew everything. It preserves that fact or that reality, but at a very high price. It envisions the Son of God speaking a falsehood for expedient reasons, R.C. Sproul says. So we preserve the omniscience of Jesus, but we've got to give up the sinless perfection of Christ, right? It's dishonest. Sproul and many others say that this is too great a price to pay to explain this conundrum. I think if we follow the lead of the early church, we don't need to take Aquinas' approach to this text, honestly. At the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451, the early church pointed to the reality of Christ's 2 natures to explain this. They acknowledged the mystery of the incarnation of God taking on flesh. How can the fullness of deity dwell in bodily form? How can that be? They acknowledged the mystery. Yet they didn't go as far as to say that we can't understand anything about it. They said there are some things we can know. And one of those things that they said was that the union of God and man in the incarnation is without mixture, without confusion or separation or division, each nature retaining its own attributes. Again, in the words of Sproul on this. Sproul just has a great way with words. Quote, the incarnation did not result in a single theanthropic nature, that's a way of saying God and man together, wherein the deity and the humanity are blended together in such a way that the divine is not really divine and the human is not really human. A deified human nature would no longer be human. and a humanized divine nature would no longer be divine, end quote. In other words, Jesus retained perfectly a fully human nature and perfectly, simultaneously, a fully divine nature. And they weren't mixed, and they weren't blended together, as it were. He had two natures, which again is a mystery. I'm just going to acknowledge that. But we see this in Scripture, right? We see this all over the place. There were times in Jesus' earthly ministry when his human nature manifested itself, right? Jesus got hungry. He felt hunger pains. He'd stubbed his toe and probably said, ah, right? Jesus needed sleep. He stepped away from the crowds at times because it was overwhelming and he needed to be with the Father in solitude and prayer. Jesus was crucified and died. He really died. His human nature, right? Died. In those moments, we see Christ was truly a man, a human being like us, with a nature like ours. But yet there were times when Christ said things and did things that no mere human could do. He could perceive people's thoughts. He responded perfectly under enormous pressure. He knew things about the future. He raised people from the dead. And of course, he himself was raised from the dead by the Father. In those moments, we clearly see the deity of Christ coming through, right? Certainly there's a great mystery here, and Chalcedon and other theologians have not explained it all by any stretch, and that's not what I'm trying to say here. But I think it's a helpful way to see a passage like this when we're confronted with difficult texts like this one. And I think what we see here in Matthew 24:36 is one of those moments where we see the human nature of Christ coming through. That there were some limitations in his human nature in terms of his knowledge and understanding. So do not be surprised at the statement in verse 36 that no one knows, not even the angels, nor the Son, but only the Father. All that to say, we cannot know the hour and will not know the hour of his return. Okay, that's the whole way of saying that. That's the first detail about Christ's return for us to know. You're not going to figure it out. Jesus doesn't even know the hour. The second detail I want to point out from the text here today, and this one will be much quicker than that one, is that it will happen during a time when business as usual is being conducted. In other words, during everyday life, okay? Notice verses 37 through 41. For as it were in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. The point of these examples is to say that Christ's return will be during a very everyday, normal time. How do you think the flood happened, right? It wasn't just a tsunami that came through out of nowhere and just wiped everybody out. It just started raining one day, right? And the rain continued for 40 days. The creeks rose, the rivers rose, and people were overwhelmed, except those on the ark, right? It just started happening on a normal day. Jesus says his coming will be the same. 2 will be walking along, and one will be taken and the other one will be left. Now, whether or not that means that the person disappears, like what we see in some renditions of this account, right? This view is popularized by the famous Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that series. They took this as a reference to the rapture of the church, where the church is, quote, caught up with Jesus, disappears, and leaves the wicked on the earth for the time of tribulation to suffer. Right? That was their view of this passage. And I'm not going to comment on that at this point because it would take us far afield into all sorts of dilemmas and difficulties in the Scriptures. But my simple thought is this. Jesus is simply trying to show us that his coming will happen in the midst of everyday life. People will be knitting and sewing and being married. They'll be eating down at the table with their families. They'll be out working in the field. And it happens. And he comes. That's the point. He's not developing for us here a full theological picture of what his return is going to look like. The simple point for us to take away here from this passage is that it will be business as usual. And then he'll return. This interpretation is confirmed by the fact that Jesus says 2 times later, one in our text today, in the Olivet Discourse, that his return will happen at an hour we do not expect it, right? It's not going to be in a moment where everybody's looking at the sky saying, this has got to be the moment. It's just going to be an everyday moment, right? Some people are going to be getting out of bed, some are brushing their teeth, some are getting married, whatever. Boom, there he is. Unexpected. So this leads to the third detail, and that is that it will happen soon. That it will happen soon. Christ's second coming will happen soon. In Revelation 22, verse 12, it says, behold, I am coming soon. That's what it says. That was a couple thousand years ago. Now, the Greek word there, tachou, soon, does not always or necessarily mean what we ordinarily mean or think by the word soon. You know, that is like after a really short moment of time. Right? We think soon is like in just a few moments, right? Rather, in the Scriptures, it regularly means suddenly, quickly, unexpectedly, fast. That's kind of what it means in many cases. One respected pastor and theologian points out that the same word is used in Matthew 28, verse 8, of the woman at the tomb. Or the women at the tomb. It says, so they departed quickly from the tomb. That word quickly there is the same word that is used for soon in many other places. So the return of Jesus may not be soon, as in a generation or two or a short span of time, but it will happen quickly when it does. That's the idea. Now verses 42 and 43 show us this, right? Therefore, Jesus says, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into, right? A thief comes suddenly, right? Quickly, unexpectedly. You're not ready for it. And that's how Christ's return will be. And that's the third detail under point number 2 that I wanted to show you. Now for the last part of my goal this morning, right? To accomplish the first 2 big pieces of my goal. The third part. What does this mean for us? Right? Let's establish a little bit of what does this mean for us. It's all well and good to know Jesus is returning. What does it mean for us? Thankfully, Jesus gives us the answer, basically, right in our passage today again, right? Verse 44. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. We must be ready, right? Maybe that goes without saying. It's a really simple point. Sure, Jesus taught us that we should not worry about tomorrow. Maybe that's some of you are thinking that. Well, how are we supposed to be ready but not worry about it? For tomorrow, Jesus said, has enough worry of his own. But I don't think that what Jesus meant in that passage about not worrying means that we forget about it, all right, or that we don't ever think about it, right? He's not saying that we should be ignorant of future things. To the contrary, Jesus has told us what is coming so that we can prepare for it, right? He said, I'm going to return, and it's going to be sudden, it's going to be unexpected, so be ready. How do we prepare? Well, again, I don't have time to unpack everything here at this point. You could preach a series just on that point alone. But for now, let's suffice it to say that you get ready for Christ's coming by living our lives in the now, in the light of his coming. Let's take our finances, for instance, okay? So it's just an easy example. When you get paid, if you know you've got a bill coming, you should save some of your paycheck, right, for that bill, right? You say, I'm going to set aside a little bit because I know I got this bill that's coming in a couple of weeks or a couple months or something. You don't run out and spend it all because you suddenly got some money, right? And then the bill comes and you can't cover it. I think that's analogous to how we should think of Christ's coming, right? We live in such a way that is mindful of the future. We see this world as fleeting and the world to come as a lasting one. So we don't put all our eggs in this basket. We don't live as though this is the ultimate, right? We live as though a greater, more significant, more lasting world is coming. And there are 1,000 applications of this. I'm just going to pull one out of the hat, really. I mean, you could really multiply applications here, but one I think that maybe is very pertinent, it's right at the heart of who we are as Christians, is our relationships. And I want to speak to that, and then I'll wrap it up and we'll go to the Lord's table here. Let's say you and a friend are arguing over some points. I want to give you a really simple, again, application of how we can live in the light of the second coming of Christ. Let's say you're struggling over some point, and it gets to the point where it's really causing a problem in your relationship, right? We can all relate to this. This is like stuff that's common to me, right? All of us have issues with spouses, kids, friends, neighbors, whatever, okay? And it's causing a problem in the relationship. How does living in the light of Christ's return and future kingdom change how we deal with this situation? Earthly thinking focuses on the now. I've got to win this argument. They're making me uncomfortable. I don't want to be around them. So for the now, for the sake of my comfort, now I'm just going to stay away from that person. I'm not going to be around them. I'm not going to talk to them. Right? That's our flesh, right? That's how we respond to difficulties in relationship. I won't give up my ground. They're being ridiculous. If I give up my ground, I'll be walked all over in the future, right? That's the way earthly thinking works. Heavenly thinking focuses on the future. Jesus died for me. He's gone to prepare a place that far exceeds this place, and he's coming back. God has made peace with me through the cross. I want to make peace with those around me, if I can, because that's what matters to God, right? So I'm going to go to that person, and I'm going to say, I'm sorry for my part, and say that I want relationship with them, even if it's hurt, if it hurts and it's hard and it's uncomfortable. I want relationship with them, if it's possible, because God wanted relationship with me, right? He desired me to be in relationship with me, and that's what the kingdom of heaven is all about. So do you see that? How it changes things? Christ is coming, folks. Will you be ready? Amen. Lord, I pray as we get ready to go to the table, that you take these words and apply them to our hearts. There's so many applications of this, Lord. Help us to understand by your Spirit what that looks like for us. In Jesus' name, amen.